The morning air over Arlington National Cemetery was heavy with silence. A light mist clung to the endless rows of white marble headstones, each one a reminder of sacrifice and duty. The towering trees stood motionless, their golden leaves barely stirring as if the entire world held its breath in respect. At the very center of this sacred ground stood the tomb of the unknown soldier, a place where silence was not just tradition, it was law. Into that silence marched Ryan Mitchell, a tomb guard of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment. His steps were precise, each click of his heel echoing like a heartbeat through the hushed crowd. He had been trained to perfection, every movement measured, every second accounted for. To those watching, he looked unshakable, almost carved from stone. Yet behind his calm eyes was a man who had walked through fire. A decorated veteran, Ryan carried the scars of war beneath his immaculate uniform, silent proof of what sacrifice truly meant. Among the gathering stood Harold Bennett, an old World War II veteran leaning on his cane, his young granddaughter Emily clutching his arm. Her wide eyes followed the guard's solemn march, and Harold bent down to whisper, "Remember this, Emily. What you see here is honor. What you see here is respect." The little girl nodded, though she was too young to fully understand. For her, it was the awe of the moment, the stillness, the discipline, the reverence that wrapped around them like a shroud. The crowd remained still, their whispers fading into nothing, as though the silence itself demanded obedience. For most, this was more than a ceremony, it was a reminder. A reminder that freedom had a price, and that here, on this hallowed ground, no man was greater than another. The sacred atmosphere was fragile, like glass, pure, untouchable, and demanding reverence. No one yet knew that this perfect stillness was about to shatter. No one could imagine that the calm march of a tomb guard, meant to honor the nameless fallen, would soon collide with arrogance and wealth in the most shocking way imaginable. The mist clung tighter, the silence grew deeper, as if the earth itself braced for what was about to come. The silence around the tomb of the unknown soldier was unbroken, until the deep growl of a luxury engine shattered the air. Heads turned as a sleek black Mercedes Maybach rolled up to the edge of the memorial, its polished surface reflecting the morning mist like liquid glass. The car door opened with a slow, deliberate push, and out stepped Victor Langston. Langston wasn't just wealthy, he was the kind of rich that made headlines. A billionaire real estate tycoon, owner of skyscrapers that cut across the Washington skyline, and a man who prided himself on never hearing the word no. His arrival was as deliberate as his reputation. He wore a navy blue tailored suit that seemed to cost more than most people's annual salary, a gold Rolex gleaming on his wrist, and Italian leather shoes that tapped against the stone like a drumbeat of authority. His perfectly combed silver hair caught the light, and the smirk on his face told everyone exactly what he thought of himself. Beside him hurried Margaret, his long-suffering personal assistant, clutching a designer leather folder stuffed with schedules and notes. Her eyes darted nervously toward the crowd, as if she already sensed the weight of disapproval settling over them. Behind them trailed Davis, Langston's driver, a broad man in a sharp black suit who carried himself with military stiffness, though his eyes betrayed discomfort at where they were. The crowd, until now absorbed in the solemn beauty of the tomb guard's precision, began to murmur. Phones were lowered, eyebrows arched. They didn't need to know Victor's name to feel the arrogance radiating from him. It was in the way he carried himself, as though this place, this sacred space, existed only as another backdrop for his importance. Victor scanned the scene with the detachment of a man entering one of his own boardrooms. His gaze landed on Ryan Mitchell, the tomb guard, pacing in his perfect 21-step march. Victor smirked, tilting his head as if analyzing a curious performance. "This is it," he said loudly enough for those nearest to hear. "All this fuss over a man in uniform walking back and forth? I thought I was coming to see something extraordinary." The words struck like a discordant note in a perfect symphony. A woman in the crowd gasped, clutching her child's hand tighter. An older man shook his head, muttering under his breath. Harold Bennett, the World War II veteran, straightened slowly, his hand tightening around his cane. Emily tugged at his sleeve, her wide eyes looking up at him in confusion. "Don't mind him, sweetheart," Harold whispered, though his voice trembled with controlled anger. "Some people mistake wealth for wisdom. They don't understand respect until it's too late." Victor ignored the ripple of disapproval, adjusting the cuff of his suit with deliberate flair. "Incredible," he continued, speaking as though the guard were deaf. Imagine standing there all day doing nothing but walking in circles. I pay people to fetch me coffee who have more value than this. Margaret's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she said nothing, clutching her folder tighter. Davis looked away, jaw clenched, unwilling to meet the eyes of the veterans in the crowd. Ryan, of course, remained unmoved. His face, carved in discipline, betrayed no recognition of the insult hurled in his direction. His march continued, precise and unbroken, heel to toe, rifle gleaming in the morning light. Every movement was a silent reminder that he served not for applause, not for wealth, but for something greater. Victor, however, wasn't finished. He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms like a performer demanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're standing here wasting your morning watching this show. But me? I own half the skyline you drove past to get here. While you're clapping for a man who doesn't even speak, I'm out there creating history." The reaction was swift. A low murmur of discontent swept through the people gathered, a ripple of indignation that grew with each passing second. Mothers pulled children closer. Veterans narrowed their eyes, and a young boy named Tommy whispered to his father, "Why is that man so mean?" His father bent down and answered quietly, "Because he thinks money makes him more important than sacrifice." Victor smirked, clearly feeding off the growing discomfort. To him, resistance was just another opportunity to prove dominance. He adjusted his Rolex, glanced at his reflection in the polished marble, and gave a soft chuckle that carried like nails scratching against the solemn silence of the place. Still, Ryan did not break. His silence, his perfect march, became a silent rebuke, louder than any words could be. But in Victor's eyes, that silence was not strength. It was weakness, and he intended to exploit it. The sacred atmosphere was cracking. The mist that had once seemed protective now felt heavy, pressing down on everyone as tension mounted. The tomb of the unknown soldier had stood unshaken for generations, but in that moment, all could sense that something was about to break. And it would begin with one man's arrogance crossing a line no one had ever dared to cross before. Victor Langston stood with his chest puffed out, the faint smirk on his lips never leaving his face. The misty morning had carried the weight of reverence until his arrival, and now every word that fell from his mouth chipped away at that fragile silence. The tomb guard marched heel to toe, rifle balanced perfectly in his arms, but Victor seemed determined to unravel the sacredness with every insult. "You know," Victor said, raising his voice as if he were addressing a boardroom full of shareholders, "I've seen animatronics at Disney World with more life than this." A sharp intake of breath swept through the crowd. Mothers pulled their children close, shielding their ears from the venom. Veterans straightened, their jaws tightening. The young boy Tommy frowned up at his father. "Why is he being so mean to the soldier?" His father crouched, whispering, "Because some men can't see beyond themselves, son. But watch, respect always outlasts arrogance." Harold Bennett, leaning heavily on his cane, narrowed his eyes at the billionaire. The old man's chest rose and fell with quiet fury. Emily, tugging on his sleeve, whispered, "Grandpa, why is he saying bad things about the soldier?" Harold sighed, voice low but steady, "Because he doesn't understand what it means to serve." But one day, Emily, people like that always learn. Victor heard none of this, or if he did, he didn't care. He waved a dismissive hand toward Ryan Mitchell, the tomb guard, who continued his perfect march without so much as a flinch. "Look at this," Victor scoffed. "A human statue. I could buy one of these uniforms off a movie set and hire an actor to do the same thing in front of my office. In fact, I probably should. At least then I'd get the credit for it." The murmurs grew louder. A woman in the back shook her head, muttering, "Disgraceful." A veteran in a wheelchair raised a trembling fist in protest, his voice breaking as he shouted, "Show some respect!" Victor turned toward the man, smirk deepening. "Respect for what? A guy who spends his day walking in circles? I run companies. I employ thousands. I make decisions that change lives. And you want me to bow my head to this?" He gestured sharply toward Ryan, his tone dripping with disdain. But Ryan did not falter. His face, carved in discipline, remained impassive. Every step was measured, every turn flawless. His silence screamed louder than Victor's ranting ever could, and that silence enraged Victor even more. "Look at him," Victor barked, his voice echoing across the marble. Not even a blink. No reaction. It's pathetic. Do you know what real strength looks like? It's the power to own, to control, to command. This, he waved toward Ryan, This is weakness dressed up as duty. Margaret, his assistant, shifted uncomfortably. She clutched her folder to her chest and lowered her gaze, shame burning her cheeks. She had worked for Langston long enough to know his arrogance, but never had she seen it clash so violently with something so sacred. Davis, the driver, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes fixed firmly on the ground. Still, Ryan's march continued. 21 steps, rifle switch, 21 steps back. Not a word, not a glance. His silence was unshakable, and that unshakable silence became a wall Victor could not break. And that made the billionaire furious. Pathetic, Victor shouted, his voice slicing through the crisp air. This man is nothing but a puppet, a relic for people too sentimental to move on. You call this honor? I call it a waste of time and money. The crowd erupted, not in applause, but in outrage. Some shouted back, others booed. A mother clutched her daughter and hissed, "Don't listen to him." "Sweetheart." A veteran saluted Ryan from the crowd, his hand trembling but proud. Harold Bennett finally raised his cane and tapped it hard against the stone path. The sound cracked like a warning shot. "Enough!" he called out, his old voice cutting through the noise. "You stand here, a guest on sacred ground, and you mock men better than you will ever be. Shame on you." For a brief moment, silence returned. Victor turned to face the old veteran, eyes narrowing. "And who are you to lecture me? Do you have skyscrapers with your name on them? Do senators call you for advice? Do you dine with presidents?" Harold straightened, his frail body trembling but his voice iron strong. "No, but I fought for this country so you could stand here today. And I buried friends who never came home so you could build your empire of glass. Don't you dare think your money makes you more than the men who lie beneath these stones." The crowd murmured in agreement, some even clapping softly in solidarity. Emily squeezed her grandfather's hand, eyes wide with admiration, but Victor only sneered. "Touching, very touching, but I didn't come here for a history lesson. I came here to see if this little show was worth my time. And so far I'm not impressed." He turned back to Ryan, leaning forward slightly as if daring him to break. "Do you hear me, soldier? Do you hear the truth I'm telling you? You're nothing. You're a mannequin in a costume, and the only reason these people care is because they don't know what real power looks like." Ryan's expression never shifted. He pivoted sharply at his mark, rifle at the ready, and began his march back, unbroken, unyielding, and in that moment, the true balance of power became clear. The billionaire shouted, but the guard endured. One man demanded recognition. The other stood as a living tribute to those who never asked for any. The contrast was blinding. The crowd felt it. Harold felt it. Even Margaret and Davis felt it. The sacred ground itself seemed to bristle with disapproval, as if the weight of history pressed down on the arrogant intruder. But Victor Langston, blinded by ego, could not see it. And so, step by step, insult by insult, he drew himself closer to a line that no man dared to cross. A line he was about to step over. And once crossed, nothing would ever be the same. The tension around the tomb had grown unbearable, like a rope stretched to the point of snapping. Every insult from Victor Langston felt like another stone thrown into still water, disturbing what was meant to be sacred. But it wasn't enough for him to mock. His arrogance demanded more, something louder, something that would force a reaction. Victor's eyes slid toward the velvet rope that guarded the tomb. That simple boundary wasn't just fabric. It was a line of reverence, a barrier of honor that no one dared cross. Even the youngest children instinctively knew to stay back. Yet to Victor it was nothing more than a challenge. He smirked, straightened his jacket, and in full view of the crowd stepped forward. His polished leather shoe landed past the rope, clicking against the marble in a sound that echoed louder than a gunshot. Gasps erupted from the audience. A veteran shouted, "No!" A mother covered her child's eyes as if shielding them from a sin. For the first time, Ryan Mitchell stopped. The guard's heel struck its mark, his rifle held firm and his head turned slowly, deliberately toward the intruder. The silence was deafening. Victor spread his arms wide, savoring the attention. "Finally," he laughed. "Now maybe the statue will acknowledge someone worth noticing." The stillness broke when Ryan's voice cut through the air. "Low, firm, steady. This is sacred ground. Step back." The crowd froze, stunned. A tomb guard almost never spoke, never broke the silence of the march. That he had done so now carried the weight of history. It was as though the unknown soldiers themselves had spoken through him. Victor blinked, caught off guard for the briefest second, then smirked again. Sacred? It's a slab of marble guarded by a man playing soldier. You don't tell me where I can or cannot stand. Ryan's gaze never wavered. His voice remained calm but iron threaded through each word. Step back. The air vibrated with tension. The crowd waited, breathless. Harold Bennett gripped his cane so tightly his knuckles whitened. Emily pressed close to his side, whispering, "Grandpa, he's not listening." "No," Harold murmured, eyes locked on Victor. "And that's the danger." Victor laughed loud and sharp. "Danger? Don't make me laugh. I built towers, moved markets, dined with presidents. And you think you can order me around?" He stepped closer to Ryan, the soles of his shoes clicking defiantly against the marble. "You're a guard dog on a leash, nothing more." The crowd erupted with shouts, some demanding he leave, others calling for security. But Ryan did not move. His figure stood resolute, shoulders squared, rifle gleaming in the dim morning light. His presence alone became a wall Victor could not truly break. "Step back." Ryan's words rang again, this time with the weight of command. Victor sneered, leaning closer as if to prove his dominance. "Or what? What are you going to do, glare me to death? You can't touch me. I'm Victor Langston. My name opens doors that would slam in your face. You're just nobody." The crowd hissed, angry and disgusted, but Ryan's face remained still, carved in unshakable discipline. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. His silence became its own answer, and for Victor that silence was unbearable. He wanted outrage, he wanted chaos, he wanted to prove that his wealth made him untouchable. But standing there, confronted by a man who refused to bend, his ego flared hotter than ever. Margaret lowered her eyes, unable to watch. Davis clenched his fists, shame burning in his chest. Harold shook his head, whispering, "This fool doesn't know what he's awakened." Victor straightened his jacket once more, his jaw set. "Fine. If silence is all I'll get, then I'll make sure this little charade doesn't stay silent much longer." The crowd shifted, sensing that the unthinkable was only a heartbeat away. The velvet rope lay forgotten, the sanctity of the tomb disturbed. The billionaire had crossed the line, not just in marble, but in respect, in honor, in humanity itself. And what came next would shake everyone to their core. The air around Arlington felt heavier than stone. The crisp autumn morning that had begun with quiet reverence now pulsed with unease. Families, veterans, children. Everyone sensed that Victor Langston, billionaire tycoon, had gone further than anyone ever dared. He had stepped past the rope, trampled the sacred line of respect. And now, standing inches away from Ryan Mitchell, the tomb guard, he smirked with the confidence of a man who believed nothing could ever touch him. Ryan stood motionless, rifle held with textbook precision, his frame steady as a monument. He had faced mortar fire in Syria, lost brothers in combat, carried the weight of scars invisible to the public eye, yet never once had he broken his bearing. But Victor wasn't satisfied. Silence infuriated him. Resistance he could crush, but this quiet defiance, this refusal to bend, gnawed at him like a parasite. "You think you're better than me?" Victor hissed, his voice low enough to cut like a blade. Then louder for the crowd to hear. "This guard dog doesn't even speak unless ordered. What a waste. My driver makes more than you, soldier boy. And he doesn't have to play mannequin all day." Gasps rippled through the audience. Harold Bennett's jaw tightened. Emily gripped his sleeve in fear. A mother whispered, "He can't talk like that here." But Victor fed on the discomfort. "Tell you what," he continued, lifting his Rolex-clad wrist for emphasis. "I'll make you a deal. $1 million. Right here, right now. All you have to do is acknowledge me. Say, 'Good afternoon, Mr. Langston.' That's it. One sentence and $1 million goes to whatever veterans charity you like." The crowd froze. Some looked tempted, others horrified. Tommy, the little boy, whispered to his father, "Dad, that sounds good, doesn't it?" His father shook his head firmly. "It's not about money, son. It's about respect." Ryan's response was silence. His eyes, hidden behind dark lenses, didn't flicker. His jaw didn't move. His steps had stopped when Victor crossed the rope. But his stillness now was heavier, more powerful than any speech. He wasn't rejecting the money. He was rejecting the notion that honor could be bought. Victor's smirk faltered. He wasn't used to being ignored. In his world, people bent, bowed, begged for his approval. But here, in this place of sacrifice, his words carried no weight. His chest burned with rage at the insult of indifference, and then, with a suddenness that shocked even him, Victor snapped. His hand shot up and across, connecting with Ryan's cheek in a sharp, brutal slap. The crack echoed across the plaza like a gunshot. Birds scattered from the trees. The crowd gasped in unison, a single collective intake of breath. Phones that had been lowered now shot back into the air, cameras recording the unthinkable. Ryan's head jerked slightly with the force of the blow, but he did not flinch. A red mark bloomed instantly on his cheek, the outline of Victor's hand stark against his pale skin. His rifle remained steady. His posture did not break. He stood, unyielding, the embodiment of discipline forged in fire. The silence that followed was heavier than the slap itself. Children clung to their parents. Veterans clenched fists, teeth grinding with fury. Harold Bennett surged forward, his cane striking against the stone, his granddaughter pulling him back in fear. "Grandpa, no!" Emily cried, but Harold's eyes burned with something fierce, something old. "That man has no idea what line he just crossed," Harold muttered through clenched teeth. Victor, breathing heavily, seemed almost shocked at his own action. But arrogance quickly patched over hesitation. He turned to the crowd, raising his voice. "Did you see that? He let me. He just stood there. This whole thing is a joke. You hear me? A joke." The crowd erupted. "You're a disgrace," someone shouted. "Get him out of here," another yelled. A veteran in a wheelchair trembled with fury, pointing at Victor. "That's a soldier. You just assaulted a soldier." Margaret, pale as chalk, stammered. "Sir, please, we need to leave." But Victor shrugged her off. "Don't you dare tell me what to do. I run this city. I run this country. These people should be thanking me, not worshiping a marble rock." Davis, the driver, looked sick, his face crimson. He took a step back, unwilling to be associated with what had just happened. Ryan finally moved, not to strike back, not to defend himself, but to speak. His voice, calm and steady, carried across the plaza like a roll of thunder. "This tomb honors those who gave their lives for this nation. You will show respect." The words sliced through Victor's rant like steel. The crowd fell silent again, the weight of history pressing down. It wasn't just a soldier speaking. It was every nameless, faceless warrior who lay beneath that marble. Victor's face twisted with rage, his ego unable to bear the rebuke. "Respect?" He spat, his voice rising. "I fund this country. My taxes pay for your little parade. You don't tell me what to do." He raised his hand again as if to strike a second time. But before he could, 2 Arlington security officers appeared, moving swiftly, their faces grim. Their voices were firm, professional, and absolute. "Sir, step back. You are under arrest for assaulting a service member on duty, and for violating restricted grounds." Victor's eyes widened. "Arrest? You can't arrest me. Do you know who I am?" He tried to pull away, but the officers seized his arms with practiced efficiency. His voice cracked as he shouted, "I'm Victor Langston. I'll bury you all in court. My lawyers will—" Ryan, unmoved, delivered one final line, his tone sharp with authority. "Your money doesn't matter here. Your name doesn't matter here. You've dishonored the tomb of the unknown soldier, and that is beyond price." The crowd erupted in applause, not wild but solemn, like a wave of approval rising from the depths of reverence. Some clapped, others saluted. Tears filled eyes. For the first time, Victor Langston's power, his money, his arrogance, all of it crumbled in the face of something he could never buy: honor. As the officers dragged him toward the waiting SUV, Victor shouted and cursed, his words growing weaker with each step. His voice, once booming with confidence, now sounded hollow, desperate, pathetic. "This isn't over. I own half of DC. But no one listened. Margaret stood frozen, her iPad slipping from her hands, eyes wet. She had served Victor for years, managed his empire, endured his temper. But in this moment, she saw him not as a titan of business, but as a small, broken man who had tried to buy dignity and failed. Her gaze drifted to Ryan, standing tall, cheeks still red, but posture unbroken. And for the first time, she wondered if she'd been working for the wrong kind of man all along. The crowd lingered, whispering, teaching their children what they had just witnessed. Tommy tugged at his father's sleeve again. "Dad, is he a hero?" His father nodded, voice thick with pride. "Yes, son, he is. Not because he fought back, but because he didn't have to." The slap that Victor had intended to humiliate had instead immortalized the guard. It had reminded everyone there, and soon millions who would see it online, that silence, discipline, and sacrifice held more power than any fortune. And as Ryan resumed his march, boots clicking in perfect rhythm, the red mark still burning on his cheek, the crowd knew they had witnessed more than a scandal. They had seen a billionaire undone by his own arrogance, and a soldier who proved that true strength lies in restraint. Victor Langston's voice was still echoing through the plaza as the Arlington security officers tightened their grip on his arms. The billionaire twisted, his expensive cufflinks glinting in the sun, but there was no escaping the unshakable strength of the two men who held him. His polished shoes scraped against the stone as they dragged him back across the sacred line he had dared to cross. The crowd followed with their eyes, silent, but electrified. Phones remained high, recording every second. Already some were live streaming the scene to thousands. Comments flooding in faster than fingers could type. Victor thought he owned the world, but the world was about to watch him fall. "Unhand me," Victor roared.
This is assault.
"Do you know who I am? I'll have your jobs before sundown." The senior officer's reply was clipped, unemotional. "Sir, you just assaulted a soldier of the United States Army in uniform, on duty at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. You are under arrest." Gasps rippled again through the crowd, but this time they weren't of fear. They were of vindication. Harold Bennett, gripping Emily's small hand, leaned toward her and whispered, "Watch this, child. Money can buy many things, but it can't buy respect." His eyes, once weary with age, now burned with pride. He had seen battles overseas, seen friends fall, but this battle, fought in silence and discipline, meant just as much. Victor tried to lunge forward, spitting fury at Ryan. "You think you've won? You're nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing. Without men like me, you'd be unemployed. I am this country." Ryan didn't flinch. His gaze was unbroken, his rifle steady. When he finally spoke, his words were simple, sharp, and final. "This country is built on sacrifice, not arrogance. You are not above it." The audience erupted in applause, louder this time, defying Victor's arrogance with a roar of approval. Margaret, still pale and shaking, covered her mouth with trembling hands. She wanted to look away but couldn't. For years she had endured his tirades, his dismissals, his greed. She had told herself it was the cost of working for power. But now, in this sacred place, his mask had shattered. She saw not a titan but a tyrant, not a leader but a coward. The officers shoved Victor into the waiting SUV, his shouts muffled as the doors slammed shut. Davis, his driver, lingered awkwardly by the vehicle, his face downcast. He didn't climb in right away. For the first time in years, he hesitated to be part of Victor's shadow. By evening, the footage had already gone viral. Every news channel replayed the moment in endless loops. The slap, the unbroken soldier, the arrest. Headlines screamed across screens. "Billionaire assaults tomb guard in front of families." "Respect versus arrogance," the slap heard across America. "Victor Langston arrested at Arlington National Cemetery." Commentators debated furiously. Some focused on the guard's discipline, calling him the very embodiment of duty. Others pointed out Victor's arrogance, his open contempt for sacred ground. But there was no middle ground. Public opinion had spoken, and it was united. Victor's empire began to unravel almost instantly. His company's stock prices dipped within hours, investors panicking at the sight of their CEO handcuffed on national television. Charities pulled out of partnerships, citing moral responsibility. Politicians who once boasted about his donations now scrambled to distance themselves. Inside his penthouse holding cell, Victor raged. He screamed at his lawyers, demanding immediate release, demanding apologies, demanding the world bend back to him. But the legal system was not built for his arrogance. Assaulting a soldier on duty wasn't just an offense, it was a stain, a mark that no amount of money could wash away. The arraignment came quickly. Cameras flashed as Victor was escorted into the courtroom, wrists shackled, his $1,000 suit wrinkled from hours in custody. Reporters shouted questions, each one sharper than the last. "Mr. Langston, do you regret your actions? Will you apologize to the guard? Do you believe money can erase this crime?" Victor sneered, refusing to answer. In his mind, silence would protect him. But silence here only made him look guilty. The courtroom filled with veterans, journalists, and citizens who had seen the video. Harold Bennett was there, cane in hand, Emily by his side. Margaret sat in the back, torn between duty and conscience, but she couldn't abandon the story now. Davis kept his distance, ashamed, unwilling to defend his employer. When the charges were read, assault on a service member, trespassing on federal property, disorderly conduct, Victor's face turned crimson. He barked at his lawyers, but the judge silenced him with a gavel. "This court recognizes the sacred nature of the tomb of the unknown soldier," the judge said firmly. "No amount of wealth grants immunity from respect." The words echoed through the chamber. Veterans nodded, citizens clapped quietly. Victor's face twisted in fury, but he could not argue. Not here. Ryan Mitchell didn't attend the arraignment. He didn't need to. His duty was not in the courtroom. It was back at Arlington, where he resumed his silent march, his discipline unbroken. But his presence was still felt. Every time the footage replayed, every time Victor's hand connected with Ryan's cheek, the public saw not humiliation but strength. For the first time in years, Victor's name was not associated with power, but with disgrace. His wealth couldn't save him. His arrogance had destroyed him. In the days that followed, a cultural wave swept across the nation. Schools replayed the footage to teach children about honor. Veterans groups rallied behind Ryan, sending letters of support, calling him a living example of military discipline. Crowdfunding campaigns raised millions, not for Victor but for wounded soldiers and their families. And Victor? He watched from his gilded cage as his empire burned. Board members forced him to resign, shareholders demanded his removal, and contracts were severed. The more he fought, the more he sank. Margaret, after years of silence, finally spoke publicly. In an emotional interview, she revealed the truth about his character. The arrogance, the cruelty, the endless hunger for control. Her voice shook, but her words carried weight. "I stayed too long, but I will not stay silent anymore. That soldier showed me what real strength looks like. And it is not Victor Langston." Davis quit quietly, refusing to drive Victor's car again. He disappeared into anonymity, leaving behind the shadow of a man who thought himself untouchable. Harold Bennett told Emily the story again and again, framing it not as a scandal, but as a lesson. "Remember, child, respect cannot be bought. Honor cannot be slapped away. Money fades, but sacrifice endures." The footage continued to spread chaos across continents, languages, generations. To some, it was entertainment. To others, it was history. To all, it was proof. Arrogance, no matter how wealthy, cannot stand against the quiet, unshakable power of honor. Victor Langston had slapped a tomb guard. But what he struck wasn't just a man, it was the spirit of every soldier who ever stood in silence, guarding the unknown. And in that single act, Victor had destroyed himself. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Every seat was filled. Veterans in uniform, families clutching folded flags, journalists with cameras ready, and ordinary citizens who wanted to witness justice with their own eyes. The air was heavy with history, and every gaze was fixed on the double doors at the back. When they opened, Victor Langston strode in, or at least tried to. His once commanding presence was now bruised by scandal. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, but the arrogance that used to make him appear untouchable now made him look desperate. He smirked at the crowd, as if daring them to judge him. But the whispers that rippled through the room weren't admiration anymore. They were disdain. The judge entered, her black robe flowing with quiet authority. The gavel struck once, sharp and commanding. "Court is in session." Victor's lawyers rose immediately, flooding the chamber with motions and objections. They argued that the arrest was excessive, that the tomb guard had provoked their client by refusing to acknowledge him, that Victor had been misunderstood. Each excuse landed like a stone thrown into a well, making noise, but never reaching the bottom. The prosecution wasted no time. They called eyewitnesses, mothers who had covered their children's eyes, veterans who clenched their fists as they described what they'd seen, and Harold Bennett, who leaned on his cane as he took the stand. "I fought in World War II, Harold said, his voice gravelly but unbroken. "I've buried friends. I've stood in places where silence was the only way to honor the fallen. What that soldier did was duty. What Victor Langston did was disgrace." Emily sat in the gallery, her small hands clasped, eyes wide. She didn't understand all the legal words, but she understood her grandfather's tone. It wasn't anger. It was truth. Margaret was called next. She hesitated before walking to the stand, knowing this was the moment she could no longer hide. Years of silence weighed on her shoulders, but as she sat under oath, the weight lifted. "I worked for Mr. Langston for over a decade," she began, her voice trembling. "I saw how he treated people, like tools, like objects. But what he did that day wasn't just arrogance. It was contempt for sacrifice, for honor, for everything this country stands for. I stayed silent for too long. Not anymore." Her testimony cracked the last of Victor's shield. The jurors leaned forward, riveted. The crowd murmured approval. Victor glared at her, his jaw tight, but Margaret didn't flinch. For once, she wasn't afraid. Then came the video, played on a massive screen for all to see. The footage captured every moment in brutal clarity. Victor crossing the line, taunting the guard, flashing his wealth. And then the slap. The sharp crack that silenced the crowd and echoed through the nation. The room fell still as Ryan's response played. His calm words, "This tomb honors those who gave their lives for this nation. You will show respect," carried more weight in that courtroom than any legal argument ever could. Victor's lawyers shifted uncomfortably, their case unraveling before their eyes. No spin, no defense could erase what everyone had just witnessed. When it was his turn to speak, Victor rose with false confidence. He spread his hands wide, addressing the jury as though they were shareholders. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am not the villain here. I am a man who built an empire, who created jobs, who pays more in taxes every year than most of you will make in a lifetime. That soldier insulted me by refusing to recognize me. I acted out of frustration, yes, but not malice. And let's not pretend one slap undoes everything I've contributed to this country." The words hung in the air, but they didn't land. Instead, a veteran in the gallery muttered loud enough for all to hear. "We buried brothers. You buried your pride." Applause followed, brief but powerful, before the judge restored order. Victor's performance backfired. His arrogance, once mistaken for confidence, now looked like weakness. His refusal to apologize only deepened the impression that he believed himself above the law. The prosecution closed with quiet force. "This case is not about money. It is not about business. It is about respect. Respect for those who gave everything so that men like Victor Langston could stand in this very room and boast." The tomb guard stood silent, unbroken, representing every unknown soldier who never came home. Mr. Langston chose to spit on that silence. Today, this jury has the chance to say what every American already knows, that no man, no matter how wealthy, is above honor. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman's voice was steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant Victor Langston guilty on all counts." The chamber erupted. Some clapped, some wept, some simply nodded in solemn approval. Harold squeezed Emily's hand and whispered, "Remember this, child. Justice may stumble, but it never falls." Victor stood frozen, disbelief etched into every line of his face. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but no words came. His empire, his power, his arrogance, all of it had been stripped away by 12 ordinary citizens and the truth of his own actions. The judge's sentence was firm. "You will serve time in federal custody, and you will pay restitution to veterans' organizations. Let this serve as a reminder. Arrogance cannot trample honor. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell like thunder. As Victor was led away in handcuffs, cameras flashed, capturing his downfall for the world. Margaret watched, tears in her eyes, not of sadness but of release. Davis, silent in the back, turned and walked out, free from the shadow he had driven for too long. And outside, at Arlington, Ryan Mitchell resumed his march. His boots clicked against the stone, steady and unwavering. The red mark on his cheek had faded, but the memory of that day lived on, not as a moment of humiliation, but as proof that silence, discipline, and honor could bring even the mightiest to their knees. The world had seen a billionaire slap a soldier, but what they would remember forever was the soldier's unshakable silence, and the truth that no amount of wealth could ever outweigh the price of respect. Weeks had passed since the courtroom gavel struck its final blow, but the echo of the case still lingered across the nation. The slap that Victor Langston had delivered at Arlington was no longer just an isolated act of arrogance. It had become a symbol, a lesson written in history. Everywhere, people spoke of it. News anchors replayed the footage with commentary about discipline and respect. Schools discussed the story in civics classes, asking children what honor meant. Churches wove it into sermons about humility. And in quiet homes, veterans told their children and grandchildren, "This is why we stand." This is why we respect. At Arlington, the silence remained unbroken. The tomb guard's march never faltered, boots striking in perfect rhythm as they always had. Tourists gathered daily, but now more than ever they stood still, reverent, reminded that this ground was sacred. The mark of Victor's slap had long since faded from Ryan Mitchell's cheek, but the moment lived on, carved deeper than stone. For Ryan, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. He did not seek fame, nor did he revel in the attention. When asked for interviews, he declined. When reporters begged for quotes, he simply shook his head. "I am a soldier. My duty is here," he would say. That silence only deepened the respect people held for him. In his restraint, he spoke louder than Victor's billions ever could. Harold Bennett often returned to Arlington with Emily. She would watch Ryan's precise steps, her eyes filled with awe. "Grandpa," she whispered one afternoon, "why didn't he hit back?" Harold smiled, his voice thick with wisdom. "Because real strength isn't in striking. It's in standing tall when someone tries to knock you down." That soldier showed heroship in silence. That's something Victor Langston will never understand. Emily nodded, her young mind imprinting the lesson. She knew one day she would tell this story to her own children, about the day arrogance slapped honor and honor never moved. Margaret, freed from Victor's shadow, started fresh. She took a position with a non-profit supporting military families, channeling her skills into service rather than greed. In her first speech at a fundraiser, she choked back tears as she said, "I spent years serving a man who thought money was everything. Then I saw a soldier prove that money is nothing without respect. That changed me." Davis left quietly, disappearing from the headlines. Rumors said he found work as a driver for a veterans hospital, choosing a quieter, more honest life. Perhaps guilt had driven him, or perhaps inspiration. Either way, he no longer followed arrogance but service. And Victor Langston? His empire crumbled like sand slipping through fingers. Lawsuits mounted, shareholders abandoned him, and his name became a byword for disgrace. Once people had whispered his name with envy. Now they spat it with contempt. In prison, he raged against walls that didn't bend to his money. His words powerless in a place where everyone was equal. But the nation remembered more than his downfall. It remembered the moment a soldier stood unbroken. The video remained online, gathering millions of views across the world. The slap replayed endlessly, but what people lingered on was not Victor's arrogance, it was Ryan's silence. His posture, his calm voice commanding respect for the fallen. That moment became a lesson far greater than one courtroom could hold. At a school assembly months later, a teacher showed the footage to her students. When it ended, she asked, "What did you learn?" A boy raised his hand. "That money doesn't make you strong. Respect does." At a small-town parade, veterans carried banners with the words, "Honor above wealth." The crowd cheered, not for spectacle, but for meaning. Ryan never saw himself as a hero. He saw himself as a guardian, one of many, carrying on a duty larger than himself. But for the people who had watched him stand firm under Victor's arrogance, he was proof that the world still held men who could not be bought, bent, or broken. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the cemetery's hills, Harold and Emily stood once more at the tomb. The guard passed before them, rifle gleaming, steps precise. Emily whispered, "He's like a statue, Grandpa." Harold's eyes softened. "No, child. Statues are stone. He is flesh and blood, and that makes his silence even stronger." The guard turned, boots striking in rhythm, unshaken, unbowed. And so the legacy remained. A billionaire had tried to buy respect, to slap silence into breaking. But all he managed was to prove that true strength doesn't come from power or money. It comes from honor. That lesson would outlive Victor Langston. It would outlive the slap. It would march on, step after step, as eternal as the silence of the tomb itself.